Okay, and we are live. So, hello everyone, and welcome to this amazing session, another of our amazing sessions called Reconnect to Goa. And I hope you had a good time with this new app or new platform that we worked with today. It was called Air Meet, and I think you got a chance to socialize with each other, and there were some tables placed there where you could interact with each other before the session began. So, welcome to this Reconnect to Goa session, and today we'll be discussing a very interesting topic. But before going to that, let me introduce myself. My name is Varun, and I'm a part of Soul Traveling. So, Soul Traveling tries to explore Goa in a very new way, in a very unique way. Soul Traveling wants to change how Goa is perceived by a lot of people. So, we have a lot of experiences happening across Goa with a lot of people from different fields, and currently we are 2.5 years old and we have 30 plus experiences in Goa in different parts. So the whole series of Free Connect to Goa was started with the aim of for everyone to connect back to this beautiful state of Goa. And today we have a special person with us as well, and I'll be getting to that in more detail. But let's talk about the topic today. It's called the Forgotten City of Ella. I don't know how many of you have heard this name of Ella. It is pretty, I mean, if you go 200 to 300 years back, there wouldn't be a person who has not heard the name. And I'm not talking about only Goa, but probably in India and rest of the world, because this city opened up the gateways of Europe to be in Asia. Yes, that's correct. And at a point of time, at its peak, it had a population of more than London did, or probably Lisbon did. So it was that famous. But then what happened to it? Where did the city get lost? We will find all these answers. And remember, this is a very interactive session. So if you see on your right, you'll see a few key buttons which you can use during this session. On your right, you have chat where you can ask your questions, and there is a tab called questions where you can ask your questions as well. For people who have joined from a laptop using Google Chrome, there's a tab called raise hand on if which is you will raise your hand for asking question, and your video will be projected where you can ask the question to the speaker directly. Okay, so these are the controls that we have, and I'm sure it will be amazing for all of us. This session is also being broadcast live on Facebook. So I would love for you, you can tell your friends as well to join us on Facebook as well, and even in Airbnb now. Now coming to the speaker for today, we have with us Tahir Narona. Now Tahir is a young architect and he has worked with a lot of interesting heritage projects. He's currently working with the Charles Correa Foundation, and he has special interest in public heritage and conservation, and he has kind of worked extensively on Old Goa as a place. I know him personally because we conducted a few trails with him, and the stories that he has to tell about the city of Ella and Old Goa are amazing, are beautiful. So without much ado, let me hand over the screen to Tahir himself. And Tahir, I will request you to take over this and tell us about the forgotten city of Ella.
Thank you, Varun, for like getting so many people together to listen to me go on one of my rants about the city. But also thank you so much to everybody who's tuned in on AirMeet, people who have tuned in on Facebook. I'm really, really grateful because this topic of Old Goa is dear to many of us in Goa, and that's also how I want to start. Uh, Let me just put my screen up, and I've got a small presentation that I would like to walk you all through, which and specifically I'm going to talk about Old Goa through her architecture. So today I want to speak about the evolution of the city known as Old Goa. Many of you are from Goa, and generally even people from India. We visitors to my state of Goa know that there is a lot of interest and excitement in this area, the history that it contains. So today I want to dive a little bit into the influences that shape the identity of this city. As an architect, I will use the medium familiar to me. I'll talk through maps, I'll talk through the existing structures that still stand today, And I'll try to explain some of my arguments of how a city can have an image and how that image can change over time. Hopefully, I'll try to weave it in a story. And over the next half an hour, I'll put some of the things that we see today in a socio-political context. Varun, is my screen clear? If you can just jump in and tell.
Yes, Tahir, it is loud. Your voice is clear in your.
Okay. Yeah. If I'm going a little fast, Varun, you'll have to call me out and tell me, okay? Because sometimes I have a habit of talking rather fast. But before we start, I want to talk a little bit about the history of Goa and particularly the capital. The first time Goa was part of like a formalized small kingdom run by the Kadamba dynasty. The capital was in a town in the south called Shandor. And slowly, as the Arabs began to trade in the Arabian Sea, the two major rivers which run through the center of Goa, the Mandavi and the Zuari, were estuarine rivers which offered very safe docking spaces for boats. And so two small ports developed, one called Gopakapatnam, which is now Goa Velia, and another one called Ella on the Mandavi bank, which we now know as Old Goa. The Kadambas capitalized on the trade and shifted their capital from Shandor to Goa to Gopakapatnam. And then eventually Vijayanagar took over. They developed Ella. Around that time, the Zuari started to silt, so the Mandavi was a deeper river, easier for ships to come in. And by the time the Bijapuri Empire took over Goa, Ella was their second most important city after Bijapur itself. Uh, our story really starts in 1948 when Vasco da Gama found the sea route to India. We know he landed in Kerala, in Calicut, and we also know that he had many issues with the local rulers there because the Portuguese just had a trading post there. And so the king of Portugal sent Afonso de Albuquerque and, with 23 ships in an armada to find a site where they could set up a permanent base of operations for their trade. Because for Portugal, India was very important in the spice trade. Pepper at the time was worth its weight in gold. And what was more was that India was a docking point to open up Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, and China, which is what they had only heard about from Marco Polo's writings. Alphonse de Albuquerque did a lot of scouting along the west coast, and they say that he sized down on two locations, Surat and Goa. Surat was a larger port at the time, but why did he pick Ella as the place to take over? Ella was an existing port. One reason possibly was that Ella had a gunpowder mill. And in that, we can see a plan. It was part of a larger construction called the Arsenal. Now, why would normally sea forts would not have gunpowder mills in them? Because the largest cannons fitted into ships. And so if a cannonball during a war hit gunpowder storage, there would be a big explosion damaging the defenders of the fort. The other reason why Alphonse Albuquerque decided to attack Goa particularly was because at that time, Yusuf Adil Shah, who had really built up Bijapuri Empire, was rather ill, and his son Ismail was fighting a war with Vijayanagar on the eastern reaches of his empire. You can see the map on the right side. And so Alphonse de Albuquerque moved in, and there was a battle between the Bijapuri defenders in Ella and the Portuguese attackers who came attacking from the river. The thing was that Ismail Adil Shah managed to motivate and move his army back from the Deccan towards Goa with the goal that he would reinforce the fort, and then the Portuguese with they had very few fighters, so the Portuguese would be forced back. It so happened that on the 25th of November 1510, the Portuguese were able to breach the wall and get into the fort. This was before Adil Shah's army reached from the Deccan. This date was the feast of Saint Catherine of Alexandria, uh, a Christian saint who the Portuguese Empire were not particular devotees of. But because they won the battle for Goa the battle for Ella on her festival day, she became the patron of Old Goa, and the most major church there, the cathedral, is dedicated to Saint Catherine of Alexandria. What I want to do is I want to look at four influences that span 450 years from 1510 to 1960. Interestingly, when Alphonse de Albuquerque landed in Goa and conquered Ella, he became the first European after Alexander the Great to hold land in India. And Ella was the first European city in this subcontinent. We talk about Portuguese a lot when we talk about Goa, especially in terms of Goa's unique culture and heritage. So, the first building I want to speak about is quintessentially Portuguese in design. In fact, it was possibly a Portuguese naval engineer. A naval engineer would normally go with the invading parties and with the, because he would be a person who could build forts, build lighthouses, build these type of things. And it's possible that Our Lady of the Rosary was designed by a naval engineer because the name of the designer is lost in history. But we know that it was built around 1540, 1550, really, really early. Mm, And we also know that it follows a distinctly Portuguese style, which later became very, very famous, called the Manueline style. Since Portugal didn't have much in terms of land, what they did have was their sea, it was the exploration over the seas, and they used elements of that in their architecture. If as one can see on the photo on the left a bit, the moldings along this church actually are in the form of ropes. Inside the church, you see little decorations in the form of ship's wheels. And I like to believe for myself that the whole uh, form of the church itself, with its high tower over the entrance and then a long body up ahead, resembles in some way the mast of a ship. The tower, additionally, Our Lady of the Rosary is built on a very high point in Old Goa with great vistas looking at the Mandavi River all the way to the mouth of the Arabian Sea. And you can even see into uh, the Ponda Taluka, which would have been Bijapuri territory at that time, with a couple of forts there. So, in some way, this also serviced as the watchtower. And inside this church, there's a very interesting spiral staircase, really tight, much like what you'd see in a fort for the cause of defense. In the 1600s, the city was growing very organically. It was growing on its own. There was nobody who laid down a plan. But as you can see in the bottom, the harbor on the bank of the Mandavi was very important. On the top left, you see what's called a lagua, a lagoon. Uh, this lagoon was filled up as the city began to grow. But Goans might know about Karmali Lake and the wetlands, and that's what's left of this water body there. When we speak about the architecture of the early Portuguese time, the conquerors built exactly as they would in Europe. The roofs were very steep, and we see two churches just outside Old Goa. St. Peter's on the left is in Paneli, which is the next village towards the west, and the church on the right is in Korlim, St. John, which is the next village to the right. These two churches, as one can see, have no real shading devices to protect them from the rain, except for the little porches made in front of the entrances. And these porches were added later. Uh, the only surviving building from this time of a secular nature is the Bishop's Palace. It has very, very steep roofs, as you can see. And these steep roofs, if I go back, were originally in these two churches as well. And we, as architects, Professor Paulo Varela Gomes called these the Ilias type churches, the churches from the central islands of Goa. They were not designed for this climate. They were actually designed for in Europe where they get snow and where snow cannot stick onto such a steep slope. But maintaining roof slopes like this is rather hard. And while it looks rather simple from the outside, we have to remember that this was at the time a very, very grand building because Portugal was openly a Christian kingdom, much like now Iran calls itself an Islamic republic. And the church had massive power. In fact, one bishop who was in power for a long time, Dom Fray Alex Menezes, also served as viceroy of India and the East. So by the mid 1600s, there were repeated attacks on Goa in general, on the Portuguese territories of Goa from the Bijapuris. And by the 1640 or so, the Marathas had also started to build up their empire. So, along with a group of locals, we trekked. If you see, there was what's called Siddhartha Goa, takes up much of the central district of Goa, which we know as Tiswadi. The wall, Goans would relate to this, but the wall sort of stretched from Old Goa now, or Ella, to Banastari, which is at the border the of the island. And it went all the way to Neora Pilar, and then it came around to Ribandar, cutting through Talauli, Kurka, many of the other parts of central Goa. The wall ran 25 kilometers, and I had the opportunity last year to trek and try and discover some of it. And I found very interesting things, like there's a massive gate called the Rajviti Gate near Healthway Hospital in Bangini, just maybe, let's say, 2 kilometers from Old Goa. And so around 400 meters away from there, there's what looks like the remains of a stable or a restroom. This map I'm showing you was drawn by Carnero, maybe 40 years later than the previous map. But what we can see is how this was a major city which took over the island of Murmagao, which stretched maybe from south to north. It's around 15, 16 kilometers, and from east to west, it's easily over 20 kilometers. So this, you can just imagine the scale of this city. And most of central Goa, and they started to call Ella the city of Goa. You can also see how the Portuguese had already by the early late 1600s, maybe early 1700s, started to fortify the entrances of the rivers. They had Cabo, which you can see on the right in the middle, which is now where our governor lives in Raj Bhavan. And on the south, they have Fort Aguada, which many people do know of. And in the north, they had the Murmagao Fort, which ruins still remain, but which is now mostly part of the harbor. So I'm now going to go into the architecture of what I call the peak time, and specifically talking about these buildings, the earliest, the main buildings like the Say Cathedral, which at the time it was built, and particularly this building got built rather fast for building its scale, possibly because of the Bishop Viceroy, who might have given it a push. It was one of the largest churches by volume in the world. In fact, it remained the largest by volume in Asia for more than 100 years later. Uh, these churches, unlike the earlier ones, weren't particularly Portuguese in design. They took textbook Renaissance ideas. Renaissance was an art, design, science, and architecture movement that started in Italy but spread through much of Europe. And Renaissance really looked at understanding certain things like geometry, proportion, as well as looking at the classical European architecture of Greece and Rome, and taking items from there like columns, pediments, pilasters, uh, and implementing them. What's interesting about this is that it was executed in the form of not just uh, the facade, which is the frontage of the building, but also in the plan, which is the layout of the building. Uh, and there's a very interesting piece of research by Nunes Pereira, who has done an amazing amount of analysis into these buildings all over, looking at how proportion and geometry and these type of Renaissance theories get executed in these buildings. When somebody gets inside the Bom Jesus, which is one of the major buildings in Old Goa, one sees also at the end of the church a barrel vault. What is a vault? The vault is when I take an arch and I push an arch in 3D. I just have many arches next to one another so that I get a roof which is curved on top. And this gives lines of action, or as we call them, perspectives, kind of emanating towards a focal point, which would be the statue of Bom Jesus, the statue of good Jesus. Uh, when we look at the frontage of Bom Jesus, it uses that's a photo on the top right. It uses a type of stone called Vasai stone, Bassein stone, possibly taken from Vasai near Bombay, where the Portuguese also had a small fort. This stone was very brittle. It's an igneous rock, but it's still much easier to work and carve than the locally available rock, which is a sedimentary rock rich in iron. You can see a little bit of it on the facade photo. It's called laterite. The designs that were carved onto the frontage in the basilica are Baroque in nature. Baroque was specifically a branch of the late Renaissance. Possibly the last thing I want to talk about in this structure for now is the tomb of St. Francis Xavier, because it's linked to Renaissance not just through design but also through who was involved in it. Because and some people um, might know the name of Medici, because Medicis were the biggest patrons of the Renaissance artists. They patronized Leonardo da Vinci, Bernini, Michelangelo, and one of the Medicis, Cosimo, was a devotee of Saint Francis Xavier. And when he died, they had this entire tomb with the cherubs and the marble work made in Italy and then shipped on a special ship to Goa. Saint Francis Xavier. Saint Francis Xavier is to me the man who spurred the Christianization of Goa. At the time when he was a student, the Catholic Church, that's in the early 1500s, was incredibly corrupt. Incredibly corrupt. Priests would take bribes to give away people's sins, and what happened is that is public, especially people from the middle and lower classes in European cities, started to rebel. The first case and the most famous case was Martin Luther, where he nailed his 40 complaints on the door of the cathedral in Worms in Germany. But more and more and more people were leaving the Catholic Church. They were disillusioned with the church. So within the Catholics, a group of young priests like Francis Xavier and Ignatius Loyola, and also Saint Dominic, Saint Francis of Assisi, set out to reform the church. This was called the Counter Reformation. By taking vows of poverty and undertaking missions to spread the word of God, uh, these groups tried to bring more people into the fold of Catholicism. And then countries and kingdoms that were strongly religious, like, and especially Catholic religious, like Portugal, put enormous power into these groups. For a long, long time, these groups did a lot of great work. They patronized many schools, hospitals, and institutes in South America and Asia. In Goa, the most notable groups are the three on screen: the Augustinians, the Franciscans, and the Jesuits. Francis Xavier and Ignatius Loyola founded the Jesuit order. A less known but very affluent group were the Theatines. The Theatines were an Italian group of monks who were never interested in missionary work. They were never interested in going out and converting people, and but they had many priests from noble families in Goa, particularly. And an Argentine historian told me in Argentina too, these Theatines became very, very influential. And one reason for it may be that they had some presence in Africa and they had learned the art of mummification. You see, a ship take took around 4 months from Portugal to Goa. And and many of the Portuguese nobles who were deputed in Goa would have wanted their bodies to be buried back in their native places safely. So giving a hefty donation to the Theatines would be very important to ensure that your body was reached home in a state fit for funeral. They because they were Italian and because they were so wealthy, they wanted to create an Italian building. So they opted for a copy of the middle photo shows St. Peter's, which is where the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, sits in Rome. They wanted the same thing replicated in Goa. But they had one advantage over St. Peter's, is that they didn't have to deal with large numbers because they were not going out and trying to spread the word of God. Their masses were just for their own group. So for them, they could use Michelangelo's original design for St. Peter's, which was on the right hand side, right on top. You see this, we call it a Greek cross. A Greek cross is a perfect equal angled cross with the altar in the middle for prayer services. Most churches are what we see below that. They're called Latin crosses. Latin crosses are much, much more practical because it gives place for worshippers to sit. It gives place for the choir. It gives place for multiple entrances. It really works for larger congregations. Because they followed the design of a Greek cross, they also had the potential to do a true dome over the center. I can go into details of what a true dome is a little later, maybe, but in the questions, if somebody's interested. But this is the only true dome, interestingly, on a major church in Goa. I'll dwell on this a little bit more because there is a controversy about this church, and I want to share my opinion on it. There exists below the altar, right at the middle of this church, a water body, a kind of well. And there are many people who have written about how this church was possibly built on top of a Hindu temple. My bits are that there may not be. One has to really do excavations to find out. But I don't think that this water body below Saint Cajetan is a temple tank, for the reason that it has a true dome, and a true dome is a really heavy structure. So you need massive pillars to support the loads that take it in. And we've seen in the maps how close Old Goa is to a river. So if one actually digs maybe 2 meters down, one starts to get groundwater gushing in. What might have been the approach of the engineers who did this project would be to maybe dig a well such that groundwater would flow into that, and their foundations would be dry so that they could lay the foundations for these huge pillars to support said dome. Uh, and what this actually kicked off by because the Theatines brought in an Italian architect is that the local nobles also started to try and experiment with churches. They were donating quite a lot to the Catholic Church, and it was around the time that Saint Francis Xavier had died and his body had not rotted, and so they started to declare it a miracle. So the Bom Jesus Basilica made another side chapel called as the sacristy. The sacristy is the first place where they've really tried to experiment on so many different things. So you remember in the older picture I showed you a vault which was just going in one direction. Over here, this vault has crossings over one another, and at the top of the crossing, little windows. And these little windows was the first time that light was pouring in from the top, and the first case of this happening, at least in Goa. Also, if you see below, these are not arches, these are actually octagons which frame the windows and doors. So there was experimentation of a kind not seen before. And some of this experimentation also was done in, I mean, we moved away from what would be a European Renaissance style to a kind of, as Zé Pereira calls it, a Goan Baroque. A new architectural style which took elements from Renaissance and from Portuguese architecture, but really brought in something completely different. And one of the best ways to explain this is St. Francis of Assisi's Church. They were another one of the influential orders. That's the middle photo. You see the two bell towers on the side. They very much resemble the minarets, especially those minarets in Bijapuri architecture. And possibly the reason for this was symbolism. Because when one looks, especially because these Portuguese were building these major structures in a place which did not have much Christian context, the ideas of what is a religious space for people living in India would have been very different from the ideas of a religious space for people from Europe. So they tried to take certain elements that one could immediately identify with a holy place and do them. They also took certain, especially from mosques. Many churches in Goa are built on top of mosques, including the Say Cathedral, because mosques always either had a large square, or were on raised areas because they were places where people would congregate to pray, just like churches. And so a lot of even placing the and deciding where to place the churches came from mosques. But now we reach maybe what I would call the third part of my presentation, the decline of the city. And in some way, the decline came soon after the peak, because there was a time in the 1700s, mid 1700s, around 1740 to 1720 to 40 maybe, when within the inner wall, of Old Goa, which covered just a little over 2.5 square kilometers. There were 20,000 people packed in that area. And this promoted epidemics, and all the more because we're living in a global pandemic right now. I think it's important to point out that that actually urban design and designing cities arose due to these walled medieval cities being so prone to epidemics. There were numerous breakouts of cholera and typhoid. So now we come to a very, very, very important character. So I'm going to really tell the story in the way of three important characters. One was Alphonse de Albuquerque, who conquered Goa and did that. And then the second big player is Marquis de Pombal. Sebastião de Melo, Marquis de Pombal, was a minister, a junior minister in the government of King José of Portugal. He took over in 1750, and then in 1755, Europe witnessed possibly the worst earthquake and tsunami it had ever witnessed, and it hit Lisbon. 80% of the city was completely destroyed, and Pombal, who was Minister for State at that time, stepped in and took the onus to rebuild the city and rebuild the city in a planned way with sanitation, with open squares, many many different modern ideas at the time. And because of his massive success in this, Pombal became incredibly powerful, sorry, and he made a plan. He then started to execute his ideas, which became known as Pombaline ideas, of on cities all over the Portuguese Empire, even in Old Goa. And this map is really, really interesting because it shows the older city in the 1750s when it was still occupied. It shows the house, it shows the state cathedral on the right, which is big and it shows the Misericordia Chapel, which is now office. It shows Saint Cajetan, it shows the Viceroy's house, and then it shows Pombal's ideal plan laid over it, which preserved some of the squares but gave clear streets so drainage could be organized. Pombal had one major obstruction in his quest to become the most powerful person in Portugal, and they were the religious orders, the same ones I spoke to you all about earlier. He was also very, very lucky because just 3 years after his massive success in Lisbon, there was what became known as the Tavora affair. The Tavora affair was a attempted assassination on King José of Portugal, and somehow or the other they managed to link one of the conspirators to a Jesuit priest who was friendly with that particular man. And because of using that as an excuse, they threw out the Jesuits. The Jesuits were at that time the most powerful, and they had massive political power in Portugal. But slowly, within the next 30 years, Pombal was able to throw out all of the orders, and many major structures fell to disrepair. In fact, what we see on the left is the Church of St. August, the Church of Our Lady of Grace, which is now known as St. Augustine's Tower. This photo was clicked by Sousa and Paul in 1940. But now the other photo on the right was clicked by my friend Lester just a month ago in 2020. And this is what you have remaining. This was not the case for all the structures. Many fell, but some of the structures were preserved. But yeah, Santa Monica was spared because Santa Monica was at that time the biggest institution for women in the East Indies, and Portuguese noblemen who were posted all the way in Japan and Macau also used to send their daughters here for a good education and also so that they would be in a safe space. A British author, Richard Burton, wrote about a lot of escapades he had in this area, trying to sneak in and have fun with some of the women in this area. But because of that, also a lot of local rulers, like local rajas, would send their daughters to Santa Monica. And that's why possibly Santa Monica and some of the other structures were either spared or co-opted into the newly reformed Church of Portugal, which now we know of as the dioceses. I'm gonna just cut away for a little bit to talk about Santa Monica because to me, it's one of the most important buildings in the history of cuisine in the world. You see, Santa Monica Convent, especially the gardens and the greenhouses in between them, is where what we call the Columbian Exchange happened for India. You can see on the left a lot of things like chilies, tomatoes, potatoes, pineapples are not from what we call the old world, which is Europe, Asia, Africa. They come from the Americas. And can you imagine Indian cuisine without potato and chili? But these things were not native to India. They were brought in by the Portuguese. And in fact, there were teachers and nuns in Santa Monica who took soil samples from all across the Indian subcontinent and transplanted uh, these plants and wrote about it and found out that okay, this plant grows in this type of soil in India and this type of climate in India, and accordingly we were able to bring these new species in and develop our cuisine so much. uh, Pombal's other project, as I showed you all before, of planning the city of Old Goa in a grid, it didn't happen. But what he was able to do was because there was probably too much of an old city. But what he was able to do was he was able to build a completely fresh city in some wetlands and swamplands near the mouth of the Mandavi, which we now know as Panjim. It took around 80 years for the city to shift from Old Goa to Panjim, but you can see the map quite clearly of the city of Old Goa, and then how other settlements like Ribandar and started to grow because people moved very slowly. Many people had been well established in Old Goa, in Ella, and to actually move to Panjim, it took quite a long time. So this is a map drawn by Cloggin. Cloggin was a Dutch merchant who was a guest of the viceroy, and he stayed in Old Goa in the 1820 or so. Cloggin drew a map of what was still standing in Old Goa and made a legend because by then most of the city was abandoned. Most of the people went to Panjim, and part of the work that we do in the organization I work at right now, CCF, and this was done by a very talented colleague of mine, Tanya, is that we went into Cloggin's map in the 1820s, and then we drew what still stands in its original form, what is demolished, and what exists in a ruin form. Uh, and I'm going to just break for a while and break chronologically to speak about one last building which shows up in uh, in the what you call Marquis de Pombal redevelopment plan. And this is the building of the Viceroy's Palace. On the left, you see a brilliant model made by Helder Carita, and just next to you see that the old city wall, which would have run along the river, and the building sort of plugs into the city wall. And just behind the stairs, you can see a little gateway. This gateway is the Arch of the Viceroy. It still stands today. But this is where I get to my last part. It changes. It changes quite drastically from 1940, the photo on the left, to 1960. And this is where the third player comes in. The third player that I want to talk about is, and possibly the one who's had the most influence on Old Goa, is Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Salazar was the dictator of Portugal. He rose to power in Portugal on a wave of nationalism and Christian fervor, because Salazar was a great supporter of the church and he wanted to restore. And he also used to keep speaking about how great the old Portuguese empire was and how now with democracy it's fallen down and how you need somebody who can bring it back to what it was. And so for Salazar, owning these colonies like Goa, Macau, Angola was very, very important. And Salazar came to power in 1930. Within 17 years, India got independence. And there was a strong push from India to get Goa also independent. There were many, many strikes and fights, but Salazar was obstinate. He did not want to let Goa go, because if he let Goa go, it would be a symbol that Portugal is no longer an empire, it's just a small country in Europe. So what he did is he got the archaeological department of Portugal to focus on heritage. He thought that by sort of paying homage and making very obvious the unique heritage of Goa, which has solid Portuguese influence, Salazar felt that he would bring about a sense of nationalism and nostalgia in Goans themselves and dissuade them from wanting to join up with the rest of India. And so he had the archaeological department made a list of 115 heritage structures, which many of them, if one translates, are just roadside crosses and squares. But this was all part of what he called at that time a master plan, where he said, okay, we'll beautify these spaces, we'll make big parks, we'll turn it into a heritage park, and we'll have an architectural plan for the same. What he did is he also deplastered the Bom Jesus Basilica. Now, so many people who know Old Goa associate the basilica as this exposed red stone church. But in 1940 till 54, in fact, the basilica was a white plastered church just like any other. And it's so amazing how quickly identities can change when things get changed like this. But by deplastering the basilica, Salazar's architects were able to show that this is uh, a completely unique architecture only found in Goa, which takes Europe's best and local material and makes something that would be inseparable and would never be able to be joined to the Indian subcontinent. But the sad truth of the reality is that this deplastering of the basilica has caused a great amount of damage to the buildings because the building was designed to be covered in chuna, in lime. And by stripping the lime off, now you can see these photos taken by Lester again, how the building, especially with acid rain, is starting to melt in certain places. Certain details and elements are starting to get lost. Uh, he also did a facelift to St. Catherine's Chapel, which was the first structure constructed in 1510. He gave it a new lease of life in 1950. And what he ended up now, many people point out to this and say this is the first building in old Goa. But really, Saint Catherine as we see it today is rather new, possibly a 1950s construction in its totality, or they may have retained certain parts. But it's very the other thing is that when India finally did come in 61, they came in by force and the Portuguese left in bad blood. They took most of their documentation with them. So there might still be records of this in some library in Portugal, but very difficult to actually research and verify. One of the other, and possibly what I think is the most contentious, is what we know of as the Arch of Adil Shah. Arch of Adil Shah is, I feel, and you can see on the photo on the right, it's two different objects which have been placed together, possibly placed together again in this whole Salazar's unique architecture vision, because it's got what is distinctly what seems to be from a Hindu temple along the sides and what is a Western scroll type top pediment of the jam. And so now this is a nationally protected monument, but it's possibly made of archaeological remains which didn't even come from Old Goa itself. They may have come from any other place, maybe from beyond in Bicholi Ponda, some parts. So we never know because of this. I'm almost at the end of my presentation, and this is what we've done recently: is we've mapped Old Goa today, where you see the heritage structures that still stand. They're in black. You see the little red areas which are demarcated for archaeology, and everything else in a lighter brown is newer development. And one sees how Panjim keeps pushing. We've got the National Highway 4 now running through Old Goa. And Panjim is giving a lot of pressure to expand because it's the capital of our state. So, where do we go? How can we stop development but still preserve heritage? And this is where I want to really point out that we don't even have to look so far outside. There is a great Goan planner, Edgar Ribeiro, who has spoken so much about how you can plan for development and heritage together. And in Delhi, the Aga Khan Trust have actually executed this in a wonderful project where they have a heritage site. It's become a tourism location, and all tourism channelizes employment for the local people who live in the Nizamuddin Basti around it. But these are just ways we need to think in a vision like this for Old Goa right now, more than ever before, because we've got such a wonderful heritage in this area, and we have to also not disregard development completely. So, yeah, thanks. Difficult, long presentation. I must have bombarded you all and I must have just galloped through. I hope it was recorded. I'll try and see if that can be shared for whoever missed through whenever the calls dropped, etc. But I really, really want to thank more than anything else Lester Silvera, who runs an excellent blog called The Balka, where he writes about heritage and architectural issues. He's most of the photos I've used here are taken by him. He's a brilliant photographer and he's really also got great articles on this. And my institution, Charles Correa Foundation, which are an NGO based out of Panjim, which work not only in the realm of heritage conservation, but which really look at taking ideas from citizens of Goa and turning them into viable projects which can be executed by the government. But also at the same time, my organization tries to give counter proposal to government policies that we think are anti people. And so, if anybody wants queries, my email address and number are on the are on the page, or you can always visit my organization website. Uh, thank you. Let me stop my screen.
That was interesting and that was amazing. Thank you so much, Tahir, for presenting it in such great detail. And actually, right from how you presented it with three different people who are very influential to Old Goa, and I can see almost 100 participants constantly staying tuned on this forum alone, more on Facebook and other channels. And now the show is not yet over. This is, the beginning of the interactions that we were always, there are a lot of questions that were coming in throughout this session. And I'm pretty sure you'll also want to, connect with a lot of people and, take questions from them. So shall we go at that, Tahir? Shall we go for this?